So lately I've been thinking a lot about my own process and how I would try to break that down. I had to for someone, and also just out of my own curiosity, I'm been trying to replicate a way to approach sketching and painting as well. And I think there are really three main things that I think about when I'm sketching like this or when I'm painting. And the three things that I'm mostly focused on are: one, breaking things down into pieces so that it's easier to see something like a portrait or a figure if you're looking at geometric forms and shapes and their relation to each other. I notice I do that a lot when I'm sketching, for sure. And then the other thing I think that is really important is paying attention to the way the elements in the face are interacting with each other. So that almost, once these shapes are being developed, things that you're building the rest of this facial structure on, it's kind of like the final elements that actually bring life to the face, the actual essence of the portrait or the figure. So the spacing between those elements is incredibly important, because especially when something like a face or a hand, the human body, when things are slightly off, it is incredibly noticeable. It's definitely very much an important thing. The simplest mismeasured aspect of a portrait can detract from an entire piece, no matter how magnificent the rest of the piece. So even with a sketch or a painting, it's really important that things are lined up correctly. Now this seems so obvious, but it's interesting that you can change measurements and change things within a face and alter the actual essence of even in non-expressive portrait. So that's really what I've subconsciously paid attention to, but the more I consciously pay attention to it, the better the piece of artwork comes out, the happier I am with the process and moving through it. It is like building the foundation of a house. If you do it correctly, the rest of the house can be wonderful and it can exist on its own. If it's done incorrectly, it kind of becomes a nightmare until the very end. And you can sort of build on it, sort of get away with parts of it, but at the end of the day, you're going to be wishing that you had taken more time. Once those shapes and those elements are developed, the third thing that I'm usually paying attention to would be the differences in values, and where there are differences that matter the most and where there are differences that I can kind of leave alone and have areas that are a little more free to improvise and draw within without thinking about too much or without stressing about it too much. In this particular drawing, I've laid down all the elements with pencil, with graphite. I've developed the areas enough to my liking that I feel like I can start to solidify exactly where things are in pen. There's no going back with pen, so I want to be sure with the pencil. And there's also areas that I've left kind of open and ready for kind of more improvised line work. My style in particular is very sporadic, and it kind of is a reflection of the way that my own mind works. I think I can relate to artists that have that more kind of neurotic, wild sense of aesthetic and a more kind of wild vision in their own head. It usually comes out in their work in some sense, in some way. Sometimes it's in the actual end product that their work is. Sometimes it's in the process itself. I think in my sketching, more of me definitely comes out because it shows exactly how I develop something, and I'm not covering it up with anything else. I think when I'm working on a painting, it can be kind of the opposite. The figure ends up being more refined. There's many layers. Things become smoother and kind of softened, but the line work and the shapes that surround the figure are more reminiscent of sketching and the drawings that I do. Here in particular, I'm starting to use cross-hatching to develop the different values. This reference I was using had some very heavy shaded areas, so I'm taking advantage of that and using line work to really define and solidify those areas, as well as kind of move beyond the reference and starting to bring in some contrasting elements and shapes as well. I use a lot of floral shapes and almost vine-like kind of curvaceous shapes around the face. I think the combination of geometric forms and those softer abstract elements is something that I really enjoy. I really like that. I like when work has something that is almost attached to a more academic way of seeing the figure or drawing, but takes on a more kind of modern contemporary type of feeling. It is almost impressionistic in a sense, the way that I draw, because it is very much very much a looser way of seeing things. It is very much a focus on light, but in a non-specific kind of, brushstroke by brushstroke, pen mark by pen mark type of way. I think that's what makes the work unique in its own sense because of that. But I know that it isn't necessarily traditional in any sense. I think the paintings end up being closer to traditional work than the drawings do. But the drawings are very much related still. Now that things have been spaced correctly, things have lined up correctly, the shaded regions are starting to take shape and really take on their own life and form. Now I'm going around and I tend to start to darken areas and develop some kind of defining areas where I want your eye to go go and then come back around to the rest of the drawing. I'm not thinking about it subconsciously 100%, but I am trying to pay attention to the reference as well. And I'm taking breaks in between line work to look at the reference, which isn't clear here in the process. It looks like I'm going from line to line without actually looking or thinking about anything at all. But I really loved the photo reference for this particular drawing, and the harsh shadows really gave me a lot of area to play with. The more contrast there is in the face and the shadows, the more that I can kind of develop line work and allow things to be loose and just move along without too much thought. And I'm still paying attention to little highlights that are in the reference. There's always like a little small highlight on the bottom lip. That's what that little piece is there. There's usually one on the nose. I'll outline that as well. And then I get to go around and kind of fill in different shapes and areas that aren't going to detract from the main look and feel of the portrait. Once I've developed cross-hatching in one direction, I will switch to darken that value, but I don't necessarily go about it in the traditional sense that line work is working in one direction and then I switch and go in the opposite direction for all shaded values. I feel like you can do that if you're looking for that particular type of look and feel a more kind of classic crosshatch ink drawing. But again, I like the mixture of all these different textures. I like leaving areas open. Areas that should have a darker value sometimes can be left open if it's not distracting, if it's not creating kind of a weird look for a certain part of the face or something. And the final lines are always the most fun because they kind of don't matter as much in the end, but they're just kind of finish up and complete a certain area. There's certain values that kind of escape me during the process, so I'll go back and redevelop those in the very end, all while being mindful of these darker shapes that have taken place and not wanting to overdo them too much. It's very easy to kind of take something too far, so I'm trying to be aware of that as well. Connecting these final lines and seeing that everything is fairly balanced, and I like the way that kind of head and portrait kind of disseminates into these floral shapes, kind of gives some more definition to where maybe a hairline starts and then becomes pure abstraction. But overall, I liked how this one worked, and I hope that those three things were helpful. Thanks for watching.